Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us in the second part of the Giving Voices two-part podcast series of speech and language therapists working internationally. Today, I'm your host, Carly, a second-year student on the MSc Speech and Language Sciences course at UCL. Last time, you joined first-year students Vivian and Claire, who spoke to East Asian SLTs working in the UK. They spoke to 3 guests from Hong Kong who moved to the UK to work as SLTs. Today, we have the sister episode. We'll be talking to 3 different SLTs who trained in an English-speaking country, then took their profession abroad to Australia, New Zealand, and France. Some of our guests are UCL's own Kirsty Catling and Anna Volkmer. If you thought they sounded familiar, that just might be why. We also have a special guest, Grace Lindley, who joins us from France. She's an SLT that I worked with when I had lived abroad in Paris. Our guests will share their inspiring personal journeys of what led them abroad and break down the logistics of how they got there as healthcare professionals. As your host, I may occasionally share bits of my experience as an American, I'm from Chicago, who worked in Paris and now studies in London. Without further ado, let's go abroad. So today we're joined by UCL's own Kirsty Catling, and Kirsty is a lecturer at UCL who actually was my lecturer just yesterday. So Kirsty, welcome to the Giving Voice podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Carly. It's good to be here.
Yes, thanks so much for joining our talk, and we're excited to learn about your experience working abroad as an SLT in New Zealand. And I'm really keen to chat with you and hear about what inspired your professional journey to go from the UK and halfway around the world to New Zealand. So I would like to start from the very top of Kirsty. What kind of SLT are you?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? What type of SLT am I? Well, I work with adults. So I work with adults with acquired disorders, mainly neuro. I started my speech therapy journey working in a split post with paediatrics and adults. And then I very much decided that my heart belonged to working with adults with swallowing and communication disorders. And I worked in some big London teaching hospitals to start with. So my career moved on, and I worked in inpatient rehab and in the community. But when I went to New Zealand, I had only been working for 2 or 3 years in the UK, and I'd been working in big London teaching hospitals, and I'd gone straight from school, A levels, to uni, and then straight into a really sort of fast-paced job, and I'd never done anything else really. And I was living in London. I've been in London for a while. It was lots of fun, but I fancied doing something different. I really wanted to change. Life in London was possibly not the most healthy in the late 90s, early 20s, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I just fancied a little bit of a change to my social life, to my work-life balance than, what I was doing. I had a couple of friends who were planning to work overseas. I had a very close friend who'd gone straight from graduating over to a place called Wanganui, which is very much in the countryside of the North Island, where she'd gone and was working in mainstream schools. And she'd gone straight from graduation, hadn't worked in the UK. And she was out there. So we were in close contact. And so it was always my intention to go and visit her and go and perhaps look at potentially working. But actually, I actually booked a round the world ticket with sort of 6 or 7 stops. And it wasn't my intention to go to New Zealand necessarily to work. It was my intention to have a year of fun and enjoy myself a bit after a lot of hard work and have a bit of a career break, really. And so then I went off to Asia and Australia, did a bit of traveling, and then when I got to New Zealand, I loved it so much, and really lovely to see it, my friend. And so I saw that there were lots and lots of jobs available, so that's when I applied.
Amazing. So you were working in London after graduating as an SLT, and then you took a pause to do this around the world journey.
Yeah.
And then you were in New Zealand and you were just fell in love with it on the spot. Is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, I think there had always been in my mind that if I liked it, that I would look for, I'd look for work out there, because I knew at the time there was a national shortage in New Zealand. They
Mm,
only had one university at the time. They've since grown that, but they only had one university in Canterbury, in Christchurch. So, and they had huge vacancy rates, and it was actually on the national shortage list. So you could sort of move there quite easily. So I sort of knew that. And I'd been around Asia, I'd been around Australia, and I had been, my plan was to do some temporary work in New Zealand, something different, bar work or ski lift or whatever it was. I was still quite young. I
mhm.
wanted a bit of an adventure. But actually, when I got there, I realized that, I actually really missed doing what I'd trained to do. And there were lots of jobs available, and it was paid well, much better than, um, bar work or being in a ski. I actually did get a job working in a ski lift as a
Did
ski lift
you?
attendant, and then realized how badly it was paid in relation. I thought, what am I doing? I've got a qualification, I've got a skill here. I should use it. So I looked for jobs, and there were lots. And some of them were a bit scary. Some of them were like sole charge of a whole hospital
Wow.
in the middle of New Zealand, which I didn't feel confident to take on. Um, so I ended up taking a job in Wellington, which
Okay.
is in the North Island. I ended up taking a job in Wellington Hospital, in the acute hospital there, working on the stroke unit mainly.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah.
And how similar was your role in Wellington compared to being in London?
Yeah, well, I'd worked at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel in London, and it's a
Mhm.
very old institution. It's very, it's very esteemed. It's sort of world leading. It's very fast paced. I worked on neurosurgery there. You'd see things like gunshot wounds, and because it was from the helipad in the Royal London, it was a very interesting place for a first job. And I was there for about almost 3 years. And then I moved to acute hospital in Wellington. It was just very, very different. So my first day, I went onto the ward, with my pack, my clipboard, my pen torch and my stethoscope, as you do.
Uh-huh.
And there was a chap sat with his feet up on the desk, wearing flip flops. And he looked at me and he went, "Hey, bro." And I said, "Oh, hello." And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm fine." Oh, and he said, "Oh, are you new?" And I sort of introduced myself, and I said, "Yes, I'm Kirsty. I'm a new speech and language therapist." And he was like, "Hi, my name's I can't remember his name, but hi, my name's Joe, and I'm the doctor on the ward." And it was just, it was just completely different experience, because it was um, so so different, so more relaxed actually, and more friendly, I would say.
Mm.
In that there wasn't that same sense of hierarchy, that everyone was on first name terms, everyone knew each other. It was a bit smaller. Whereas in the Royal London, I felt a little bit lost at times, like sort of speech therapist starting out. I knew a couple of the doctors, but they certainly didn't, I didn't have sort of a friendly relationship with them as such. Whereas in New Zealand, it was very different. And I remember I went to my first NDT ward round, and one of the consultants had baked lamingtons, which were these sort of Kiwi, for because I joined and I was new to she wanted me to try them, and it was a very different experience, and everyone was very welcoming. It was really nice.
Well, that sounds nice. And it
Yeah.
sounds like, yeah, it is a distinct work culture difference that you were experiencing there.
Yeah, I'd say it was a bit more sort of hierarchical. I think we were in the UK, it was a little bit more formal, perhaps. I would,
Mhm.
it wasn't less professional as such. I mean, the people were very professional, but perhaps just the style of interaction was different.
Mm.
And it was interesting. I think that I was expecting there to be a lot of Kiwis in New Zealand, obviously, but in Wellington particularly, it was very international. And so there were a lot of people from all over the world, really, and that was quite interesting. So my boss was from America, had trained in America. We had someone from Hong Kong. We had two people from Ireland, people from Australia. So it felt very international, and that was interesting to work with people who had trained, lots of different people who had trained in different countries, in a sense of being a team. But what was really interesting was that practices were almost identical, from video fluoroscopy to, the therapy, the dysphagia therapy, it was exactly the same.
How long did you stay in New Zealand? Because now you're back in London, so you eventually made your way back over here. So how long was your stay at the Wellington Hospital, and why did you decide to come back to London?
I was in Wellington for 2 years, and I would have probably stayed there forever if it had been up to me. But I had a boyfriend who's now my husband, who I've been with for a very long time, and he wanted to do some further studies. So he wanted to do a master's degree, and to study overseas, again, as you know, it's incredibly expensive. And he'd found a course that he really wanted to do back in London. We also had family, I had an elderly mum and, family members that I had a niece who was quite young, who I still want, we wanted to see our nieces and nephews grow up. And it's a pull. It's a very long way away. So it takes, over a day to get there. It would take 24 hours, so it's also, something to think about is that at the time the New Zealand dollar was much weaker than the pound, so if you're thinking about coming back to the UK and affording to be able to come back to the UK, that would have been it would have not been easy to do that regularly. The other thing was that New Zealand was quite isolated. I thought it would be quite close to Australia, but it's not really. It's about 6 or 7 hours flight away.
Well, do you still remember, I could imagine with this kind of vibe that you were talking about at the hospital, that there would have been a little goodbye party or something for you?
Oh, yes, we did. I remember we had a lovely goodbye party. I mean, one of the fabulous things, and I haven't mentioned, one of the fabulous things about New Zealand was getting to work with different cultures that I hadn't worked with before. So the Maori and the Polynesian cultures. And so I actually did a sort of a Te Reo Maori course while I was over there, so I learned to speak a little bit of Maori. It's very, very important that you learn to work and learn the cultures. But the cultural differences over there for working with Maori people and working with the whole whānau, which is the family, it's quite different to the UK. And so when I left, actually, some of my Māori colleagues gave me a wonderful send-off and sung me a song and in Māori, and they have a sort of ceremony at a marae, which is their sort of like where they worship. And I remember when I started, I went to the marae and I had a welcome ceremony, a very, very wonderful culture, which I really enjoyed getting to experience and learn more about.
Oh, wow. I'm going to put you on the spot to ask if you remember any expression or saying in that language.
I can sing. I still sing to my children a song in Māori. I won't put you through that, but I used to sing. I used to know a lot of words to do with swallowing and eating and drinking. I once did a swallowing assessment with fresh oysters that were caught that day, because Māori elderly people, often eat a lot of seafood. the swallowing oysters is quite an interesting process. It's quite fast.
I've actually always wondered that because here in the UK, we're learning dysphagia training and they talk about having a biscuit, some cake. And I did wonder in other parts of the world, if they're trying to evaluate swallowing, I'm sure they're using different foods. Case
Yes.
in point, using
Yes.
oysters.
Yes, that was quite unique actually. That was someone that bought it, a family member that had bought it in. We didn't have fresh oysters sat in the fridge in
Oh.
New Zealand, unfortunately. But no, it was yeah, I mean, it was standard. It would have been cake, biscuit, banana in New Zealand. But I think, where it was culturally more appropriate. This gentleman really had a stroke and he really wanted some fresh oysters, is what he had every day. So his family brought him in some. And so we did a swallowing assessment with it. It was really interesting actually, because I remember elderly Maori gentleman, just his eyes completely wide open when I went in and sort of spoke te reo to him, and he said, because Maori's, the name for sort of non-Maori people in New Zealand is Pakeha, and he said, "Are you Pakeha?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm from the UK." And he burst out laughing and said, he said, "When I was a child, I wasn't allowed to speak te reo." He said it was sort of not encouraged. I had to speak English. He said, "Now I'm in my 80s, sat in a hospital, and an English girl comes in and speaks te reo to me. That's made my day." And so it was lovely actually to. I really enjoyed the Māori culture and learning about it, and learning about sort of their mythology and about the different cultural values. I think it was quite different from when I'd been in Australia. In New Zealand, there was something called the Treaty of Waitangi, and they had when the settlers arrived, and the Māori were given. I suppose there was much more of a sort of mutual recognition. So they were much more. There was much more emphasis on biculturalism, where the Māoris were sort of, I think, given much more equal footing from the start of the colonisation. So much more valued, I found, than in other places and it was a real emphasis that when you worked in the health service, you made a real effort to attend bicultural awareness training, that you learnt some te reo and you used it with Māori patients. That, I remember working on the ICU there, and the whole ICU waiting room would be completely filled with about 40 people, because the whole whānau would come, the whole family, and like the elder would come of that family and be there as a spokesperson, and the whole family was involved in decision making. So it was very, very different to how you would, I'd been in London, and a lot of the elderly people I worked with, sadly, were quite, didn't have a lot of family members around. And then I went to New Zealand, and oftentimes it was very different, but just really interesting. There's also cultural decisions around nil by mouth, and where food is very valued, particularly in Polynesian cultures as well. I worked with lots of Samoans, and I had a lot of conversations with people not about people being nil by mouth and them finding that very, very challenging. But yeah, it was just super, super interesting all round, really.
It sounds like it was an incredible experience, and you learned so much culturally in the profession. And I can hear all the happiness that you have when you're sharing these memories.
Yeah, it was great.
That is so cool. And I'm going to try to take you back all the way to the beginning, when you were first preparing to go abroad. I don't know what it was like at that period of time, but how was it to try to take your professional status abroad? What was that process like?
Yeah, well, we had then the mutual recognition agreement. So if you are a speech therapist in an English speaking country, I think it's Australia, New Zealand, America, England, Northern Ireland, all of those sort of English speaking countries, Canada, there's this thing called the mutual recognition agreement, where our qualifications are mutually recognized. There are some slight deviations that I know you are aware that there's some different requirements for America around audiology and things, and there's some differences in dysphagia training as well, but at the time it was fairly easy. All I had to do was send my degree transcript, my full transcript, and fill out a few sort of documents. And then I just sort of became, and because I was a member of RCSLT, a full member of RCSLT and HCPC, that was just fully recognised. And I didn't find it too difficult, actually. It just took a couple of weeks, I seem to remember. It wasn't long at all. And I had to change my visa because I had a working holiday visa when I got to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And I then had to apply for a more permanent visa. But I was sponsored by the workplace once I'd been offered the job. Okay. But they had to prove that they couldn't recruit a New Zealander to the post, but they could because it had been vacant for a while.
Okay, interesting.
So it was all fairly straightforward in that sense.
Gotcha. So while you were in New Zealand, you still had maintained your RCSLT status. And yes. So you were always associated with the UK's professional program for speech language therapists. You did not become a part of the New Zealand organization?
I did. Yeah, so I was both. I had both memberships because I knew the plan was for me to return at some stage, so I thought it would probably be easier. So I carried on paying for the two, and still completing my CPD diary because I'd got into the habit anyway of doing that while I was, practicing. So yeah, I joined both. So I was a full member of NZSTA. And I think I was an overseas member, I think, from RCSLT, because you can have that option. Mm-hmm. And then when I came back, it was no problem to just convert back to, the full member of RCSLT. So there was no big problem because it was only it was just under 2 years. So it was not a huge problem.
Okay. Well, that's always good to know because that's something that I'm looking into myself of wanting to work abroad and how would that work and maintaining my status. And do you apply for the other country's status as well? I didn't know that you could have both memberships at the same time. So that's really interesting to learn.
Yeah, I don't know if that's changed, but I certainly thought it was useful because it was an absolute requirement for the job. I had to be a member of NZSTA, which is the New Zealand professional body. But I went to a conference. I went to one of the national sort of NZSTA conferences actually while I was there. But it made it a lot easier, I think, coming back that I didn't have to rejoin.
That's the rumor that I've heard. You certainly don't want your membership to lapse because that can be a bit of a headache to try to get it rolling again.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. So I have a question. Was there anything that you felt was a gap in your knowledge when you had gone to Wellington Hospital?
As I say, I think clinical practices were incredibly similar. So not really clinically, but I think the acute services were very, very similar to the UK. But I think that if I'd have worked I didn't drive at the time, being in London, so I couldn't work in the community. I'd loved to have because there were this beautiful coastline, and all these fabulous adventures. But no, I couldn't work in the community, and I didn't have any rehab experience at that time. I'd only had acute experience, so I just worked in acute, and it was very, very similar. I would say one of the things which was quite different was sort of around governance. And in the UK, I was very clear about clinical governance and what the standards were and how you reported incidents and all of that sort of, it was quite clear. And in New Zealand, I think it was less clear at the time. And I had a few instances, interesting thinking about, we just had a lecture around ethical dilemmas, haven't we? And I talked about this when we started, but I had a few ethical dilemmas that I don't think that I would have had to deal with in the UK because the context is different, and I don't think I was very prepared for them. So an incident I had was they had a paediatric post in the hospital that hadn't been filled for about a year. And they had they couldn't find paediatric therapists for neonate, a very specialist area, and I didn't have any experience in neonates and neonatal swallowing, and they asked me if I would cover it for 2 days a week. They also asked me if I would cover voice outpatients one day a week. So, this
Full
sort of,
range.
yeah, exactly. The sort of thing you probably wouldn't get in the UK, because the teams are much smaller. Were at the time.
At what period of time was this?
2004 to 2006.
Okay.
I said that I would work in, because I had some experience working with paediatrics in my first job in the community, and some acquired disorders with paediatrics in the community. So I said, sort of young strokes and brain injury, sadly, and brain tumors. So I said that I would work with those children that were above, so that were, had more anatomy that was similar to adults, but I wouldn't work with the neonates because I had no experience at all. I hadn't even held a baby by that stage in my life, and they quite frankly petrified me.
Oh,
So
no.
so I just said, I wouldn't feel comfortable also advising mothers about feeding babies. It just felt completely alien to me. So what I did do was I said that I would go on a training course at Starship Hospital in Auckland, which is their sort of Great Ormond Street equivalent, is their specialist hospital. So they sent me up to Starship Hospital, and I did a paediatric dysphagia training course for a week. I remember an intensive course and neonate feeding, and someone from Starship supervised me. So I did eventually end up doing some cover on the neonates and the paediatric wards as well. But I very much at first said, oh, and it quite shocked me that I was asked to do it, in a sense, because it's a very specialist area. And again, at the Royal London, they had a team of sort of, at the time, 3 therapists who were dedicated to that area. It was very specialist. It wasn't seen as something you could just have a go at. So it was different, very different.
It sounds different, and I can imagine that national shortage of speech therapists was certainly playing into it at the time too. But that's a really amazing opportunity that you did get to have, working with so many different domains in speech therapy. So that's quite exciting that opportunity presented itself at the time.
Yeah, and I think that that's what it gave me. There's a phrase in New Zealand which is called Kiwi can do, and I think because it goes back to the roots of this sort of frontier society, like on the edge of the planet, where these people emigrated, and it was a tough landscape, and they managed to sort of build this amazing a society over there. But there's this sense, and it's called Kiwi can do, we can do it, and it's quite different, I think, in terms of culture to the UK, which is perhaps, a lot more established and older, and there's lots of sort of, ways of doing things. And I think that I learned to be really resourceful and resilient over there, and confident that, being thrown in at the deep end actually increases your confidence, doesn't it? Rather than being protected and saying, oh, you can't do that because, you're not skilled. So it was good in that sense. Yeah.
Oh, nice. And for those who are interested in diving into the deep end to move abroad, would you have any sort of guidance or advice of how to prepare for a move abroad?
Yes, I would do your research. I think it's really important to find out things like, how do you set up a bank account in a foreign country? I remember in New Zealand, you had to pay to set up a bank account, which I was thoroughly shocked by. And you had to pay for a lot of things, which I was thoroughly shocked by. You had to pay to go and see the GP. Just sort of do your research about how things like that work, the day-to-day stuff, healthcare, insurance, banking, how it all works in that country, the exchange rate of the money. If you're going to be paying UK debts, which I was at the time, with the currency that's weaker, that's going to be a challenge, which it was a huge challenge. If you can speak to anyone who works already as a speech therapist in the country, find out about things like CPD, find out about things like annual leave entitlements, find out about the cost of living, things like how much it costs to the same things that you would if you were moving anywhere, really, to make sure you can afford it, to make sure you're not going to land yourself into any trouble. things like the things that I looked on the NZSTA website. There was lots of information about the mutual recognition agreement and what I'd need to do around sort of recognising my qualification. So, I think things that, so to work in America, it's quite a rigorous process. You have to provide a breakdown of all the hours that you have worked with various different client groups, not just the placement settings. So, if you're thinking of it, try and keep a really good record of all of your placements, all of your placement hours, all of the client groups, things like, if you've worked with Down syndrome, if you've worked with DLD, if you've worked with aphasia, how many hours you've actually spent, because that's the sort of thing they might ask you for. I mean, it wasn't the case for me. I was quite straightforward, but, it's worthwhile just doing your research and finding out what's needed. So that was the other good point of a resource, is the High Commission for the country, the embassy for the country that you're wanting to travel to. So the New Zealand High Commission, just finding out about visas, finding out about, especially at the moment, goodness, about sort of travel and entry requirements, so that's a good source of support. And I mean, I was saying, back when I was traveling, I had a Lonely Planet guide, and that was pretty much my Bible. But nowadays, there's so many resources online about and communities on social media about living and working overseas that, I'd really advise people to join those and look at those.
I think those are good tips, and tips that I resonate with as well, having come from one country and now I'm studying in another. And yeah, definitely do your research. And when you think you have enough research, maybe do a little bit more too.
Yes, but also do it. Don't overthink it. Go for it. You can do it if you want to. It's achievable. I didn't come from a very affluent background. I had to save a lot of money before I went away. It's just a case of planning and researching and going for it, having the sort of oomph to say, I can do it.
That sounds like a Kiwi can-do attitude.
It does, doesn't it?
Amazing. Well, now I would love for you to indulge us a little bit about what was your favorite part of living in New Zealand, living there and also working as an SLT abroad.
Well, New Zealand is an amazing place. It's absolutely beautiful. And I got to do a lot of traveling when I was there. So if I'm honest, there's that experience of just seeing things like the Milford Sounds, the Abel Tasman, kayaking, seeing pods of dolphins and killer whales and whale watching and, and catching fresh power, abalone, and having a barbecue on the beach. It was a very different existence, and met some fabulous friends. I think when you live overseas and you don't have your family around you, your friends become very important. So I met some lifelong friends that I'm still in touch with. So that was excellent. And I also think that living in New Zealand changed me in terms of my leisure pursuits. When I lived in London, I spent a lot of time in dark pubs and restaurants and music venues and cultural theatres and doing sort of cultural and not so cultural things. But in New Zealand, in Wellington, there weren't as many options. So I quickly sort of decided that I needed to expand my, my experiences. So, the beach was about 10 minutes from the hospital. So, I could go for a sea swim. I would cycle to work. I started hiking and I did a lot of, they call them tramps in New Zealand. So I did a lot of sort of weekend hikes up volcanoes and glaciers, and so it gave me a real passion for the outdoors and a real passion for walking, hiking, kayaking, that sort of thing, and wildlife that I perhaps had become a little bit unconnected from whilst I was living in London. And when I came back, it sort of stayed with me. So I think that was a real benefit. It made me healthier, made me sort of reevaluate what made me tick. I think from a professional point of view, I've talked a little bit about sort of the sense of giving me confidence, giving me this attitude of giving things a go and being sort of resourceful. Think that I think again, going back to the working with lots of different people from different cultures and backgrounds, learning about the Te Reo Māori language and about the culture, really sort of just cemented my love of that, all of that sort of thing, learning about different people and the way that they live. So yeah, all round it was a amazing experience that I look back on very, very fondly, and I'm so glad I did it, because my life these days is incredibly different.
It sounded like it was an incredible chapter of your life that continues and radiates in different ways today. And I feel inspired to want to go to New Zealand.
Me too. I want to go back
to work. Yeah, do it all over again.
Go for it. Go for it.
I'm very excited to introduce Grace Lindley, coming to us live from Paris, France. Grace is an English-speaking SLT who trained in New Zealand and now works in a Francophone country. She's someone I've had the pleasure to get to know when I lived in Paris, and Grace let me work under her wing as an SLT assistant before I started this master's course at UCL. I've learned a lot from her and have been inspired by her SLT journey, and I think you will be too. Grace, welcome to the Giving Voice podcast.
Thanks, Carly. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So I want to start from the very top of Grace. Who are you? What is your SLT role?
Right. Well, I am an SLT who works with mostly 2 to 5 year olds. That's really what I like, the age group that I like to work with, that pediatric side of SLT. And I have a private practice. So I do home visits for my clients, and I also see them in clinic. I have a clinic space that I rent, so they can either come and see me in clinic, or I go to their homes, or I'll also go and work in schools. So a little bit of a jack of all trades, but mostly 2 to 5 year olds, some school age children, some adolescents, but no adults at all. That's not my jam.
You're with the kiddos. So you're over in Paris, and Paris is a long way away from New Zealand. So what inspired this whole journey to go from New Zealand to France, which isn't even an English-speaking country? So it would be surprising for an SLT that's so focused on developing the English language and communication. Could you tell us a bit about that journey of how you got here?
For sure. So after graduating, I had a job in New Zealand that I wasn't very happy in. And at the same time, I had a boyfriend in New Zealand who was French. And so we had decided, like after my year at my job, that we would just go to Paris for a year, just like that, like just for fun, just 1 year, go to Paris and then come back. Like our plan was not to stay in France. So we went to Paris, and the job that I found there was it wasn't as a speech therapist, obviously, to start with. I was just being an assistant to a family that had 2 children, boys with autism, and I would accompany them to school, and I would do some therapy at the home. And I did that for a year. And while I was there, I saw that there is such an incredible need for English speaking speech therapists in Paris, because French people and French speech therapists don't speak English. And there is a lot of expat families there who have children who need speech therapy and then are unable to find it because there's no one who can provide those services. So after 1 year in Paris, I decided I'm really not finished being in France. I really want to stay longer. I had kind of just learned French. I didn't speak French before coming to France. So I had just learned French to a level where I was like able to converse a little bit. And it just felt like such a waste to go back to New Zealand after 1 year. And so my partner and I, we got a PAX, which is like a civil union, a French civil union. And so that I could stay. And with that status, I was able to set up my private practice in France and never looked back. It's been 9 years.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So going back 9 years ago, were you quite surprised that there was a demand for English speaking speech therapists in Paris?
Yeah, I was. Before coming here, I didn't realize 2 things. I didn't realize how big the expat community is here. how many international schools there are. That kind of goes along with the expat community, but then also like how poor the level of English is here. Like people really don't speak English. Like I'm talking about French people. So it's not like other countries, you know, Germany or Holland, where if you have a speech therapist, they're also going to speak English. So, you know, you really could go and see one of the speech therapists there and it would be fine. Their English level is good enough. French people, like for the most part, I know there are exceptions, but for the most part, their English is so poor that families looking for services like they really can't work with a French therapist. Also, there is a little bit of a gap in let's say the education of certain speech therapists in France, like when it comes to working with children with autism or children who are maybe more have more severe communication needs. Like the training is just not the same, the mindset of how to work with the child is not the same, and so those families who have children who have more profound needs often are just kind of not able to receive services by anyone in any language.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what those kind of gaps feel like? Because it sounds like from your training in New Zealand that you learned a certain way to approach somebody with more severe difficulties.
Yeah.
And it sounds like in France, there's a different approach. And for an expat family, there's kind of a conflict of interest, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. I think French, let's talk about orthophoniste. So that's the word for a speech therapist in French. So like the orthophoniste, I think they are really good at working with a certain type of population, which is like for children, school-age children who have difficulty like reading and writing. They're very strong with working with kids with dyslexia or is it dysgraphia or anything like that. They're very good at this. I don't think they have as much training when it comes to working with children who might need like the use of AAC, children who are nonverbal or really minimally verbal. Whereas that's something that I'm much more comfortable working in. So I would prefer to work with those kids, the more severe, profound communication needs, and working with dyslexia or whatever in schools is not something that I'm comfortable with. So we really just are not even wanting to see the same types of clients. So it's super interesting.
Sounds like you complement each other in
a weird way. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when you were in New Zealand, were you working with a very similar client group to what you now are here in Paris?
Yeah. When I was working in New Zealand, my last placement, which was like a 3-month placement, and then my first job was both working in special needs schools. And I was working with children who are a little bit older than I am now. I was working with 5 to 21. But I really had a thing for working with those like 5 and 6-year-olds. I've always really liked working with little kids, but it was kids who had quite profound needs, who were nonverbal or minimally verbal or needed a lot of support. And so, yeah, I was already doing that before I came to France.
Gotcha. And you've kind of touched upon this already, but were there some cultural or societal challenges or confusions that you had entering France and then working with the expat kids? I remember when I was working under your wing, sometimes I had to search on the internet, what are cartoon characters relevant to French children, so I could be more engaging. That was something I didn't know with my American background of what a little kid in France is exposed to.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there was any cultural or societal challenges that you had to overcome.
I mean, it's a tricky one because the families that I'm working with are not even necessarily all native English speakers. Like they're from all over, you know, multilingual, multicultural. English is like the easiest language for them to receive therapy in sometimes, but I've been working with so many different cultures and languages. And so there's always stuff, you know, like you mentioned, like cartoon characters or whatever, children's songs, nursery rhymes. I'm like, I know literally no nursery rhymes from your country. And like, that's something that I use a lot in therapy is singing nursery rhymes. So I have now had to learn a bunch of French nursery rhymes. I can sing some French nursery rhymes now.
Impressive.
But I think one of the biggest cultural differences really is people's attitude, I think, towards people with special needs in France compared to people's attitude towards people with special needs in New Zealand. Like there's quite a big difference there. In France, it's really difficult to find a place in a school for a child with special needs. Any child, even if it's mild, you know, even if any child who just is a little bit like learns differently. It's really challenging to find a place in a school. And I use the word school very loosely because the places that you do find are more like daycare. So there's like, I feel like there's less of an educative approach for children like that in France, and more of like a just keep them occupied approach, which is really, really sad.
Yeah. Because you work with families who are coming from all over, I imagine that there would be a lot of different perceptions of speech and language difficulties, and how they're maybe perceiving their child, or even how France is perceiving them as a family. Do you do quite a bit of education with the parents as well? Or how do you kind of approach parents who maybe are struggling with a society that's not as supportive to their child's needs as maybe back in these people's home countries?
Yeah, we talk a lot about it with the families, and oftentimes, like, we do have, it depends on the child, but if the family has the opportunity to move back to their home country, like, that's something that I will be like, that's a good idea for you, because the options for your child in France, depending on the child, depending on the family situation, are limited or expensive. Like, if you have the money to pay for there are good schools here, but they're really expensive compared to, like, you might be able to get the same thing for, I don't even know how much less in your home country. So that is a conversation that I have often with parents. And then, if you have a family here who are expats and they just don't have the support of extended family as well, it's just really challenging. It's a hard place to be for an expat family if you have a special needs child. If the family has like half of the family is French and they have family here, it's a little bit different. But even then, the attitudes they're just different. I remember in 2013, that was my first year working here. One of the mothers that I was working with, she got told saying that it was her fault that her child had autism because she was cold towards the child. And, like, it was shocking to me that, like, this kind of misinformation was still happening. So I think France is just very behind in their attitudes about children with special needs.
That's really interesting. And that's an interesting cultural difference of how you were trained versus what you're experiencing now in this other country. And that sounds really challenging. And I'm going to turn the tables to talk about some of your highlights of working in France. Of what have been some of the most enjoyable parts of being an SLT in a foreign country?
Well, I absolutely love my job, and my job is the main reason why I'm still in France. Like, I adore what I do here. So I definitely don't want to put anyone off because, no, it's really incredible. Something for me that I've always loved is I'm quite independent. And even when I was going through university, I was self-employed. I was a piano teacher. And so I think for me, being self-employed here, like, it just fits with me really well. I love being able to choose the clients that I take on and choose how much of my time I'm dedicating to therapy. I really adore working with so many different cultures, so many different languages. I have picked up words from, like, so many languages. Like, I feel like I could meet someone from almost any country and be like, I know a few words from your language, because when I'm working with, like, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, even if I'm speaking English or I'm modeling certain strategies to the family, I'm going to be including words from their native language. And so that's really exciting to me. As a speech therapist, we love languages, right? So that's been super exciting. And then I just love living here. I love living in France. I love living in Europe. I love that I have so many different cultures and languages, again, just at my doorstep. I can take a 2-hour flight and I can be in Spain and Portugal and Italy and Germany, like, so different. It's so exciting. So I love being here. And another cool thing is, kind of creatively trying to find ways to improve my, to continue my education. And so doing certain trainings when they come up, but in different countries. So, like, I've been to Ireland for trainings and, like, work with Irish SLTs. I've done some in France, and it's just really, it's exciting. I just love it. I really do love being here.
I'm a little biased too, because I so enjoyed my time in France as well. So I can understand. So you talk about how you have your own private practice. And I know from working with you a bit that you do collaborate with other professionals. And I'm curious to hear who are these other professionals? What is this kind of group that exists there in Paris? And what is it? How did that all come together?
Sure. So the therapist that I collaborate the closest with is an occupational therapist, and we share clinic space together. I love it. I think occupational therapists and speech therapists should be best friends forever. I think our fields are so complementary for the type of child that I work with. But we are also, both of us, members of a group in France that's called Sprint. And that's just basically a group of expat professionals, speech therapists, psychologists, occupational therapists, art therapists, dance therapists. Like there's all these types of therapists who provide services in English. So it's an association in France, and we have to prove our credentials to be a member. And there are certain things that we have to do to keep up our membership. But it's kind of the main group of therapists who speak English in France.
Yes, I know that's how I found you actually, was doing a Google search, and I found this Sprint webpage, found you, your description, and gave you a little email.
Yeah, that'll be it. Yeah. And then also after being here for so long, I know the pediatricians and psychologists, and so who work with English speaking families here. And so if they have a child who comes to them and they are concerned, they will often contact me as well. So that's another way that I get clients.
Nice. So is that also through the Sprint network, or is that sometimes even stemming outside into
it's outside?
Sprint?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these people, the pediatricians and psychologists, are people who work in French and English, but they know that I have my private practice and that I work in English. They know that I have my private practice in English. And so when they have a child who comes along and they need therapy in English, they will send them my way. So, I mean, it's really just like word of mouth, and it's who you know. And like the expat community is kind of small, so word of mouth goes a long way.
That's really interesting. And it's such a stark contrast coming from London over here, being in a very structured National Health Service, compared to creating your own private practice, being very much so an entrepreneur and networking and developing your contacts, and then your name spreading word of mouth. It's a very different way of going about speech therapy, but a very exciting way to be doing it too.
Yeah, it is. And it's true. It took time. Like my first 18 months in my private practice were really challenging because I didn't know anyone, and no one knew me. But the thing is, there is such a need for the work that we do here. And so it's just a matter of like meeting people and getting your name out there and like visiting the bilingual schools. Like I remember just calling pediatricians or emailing them and be like, hey, just to let you know, I'm here and I work in Paris. And like, these are the types of kids that I love to see. If you have any concerns or you'd like to contact me, I'd be happy to meet up with you. I would love if you could send clients my way if you have any concerns for them. And everyone was super open because like I say, like there is a need for what I'm doing. So it was really just like putting it out there that you're doing it. And then people are going to be like, oh my God, yes, I need this.
Yeah. Now I want to address the éléphant in the room and ask you, so do you speak French with your clients, or do you gear it to be more English speaking?
So this is the thing to start with. Well, to start with, my French was not great. Like it was okay. After 9 years, my French is pretty good. The thing is, if I have a family who comes to me, and this has happened multiple times, where the child has something. So just background information, I've done a lot of extra training in childhood apraxia of speech. It's my the disorder that I'm most passionate about. I find it really fascinating and I just love it. And those are the types of kids that I love to work with the most. And it's not something that we see every day, but it's something that I'm really, really passionate about with their children. Because I have one family, exactly the same situation on my caseload at the moment. The family is Ukrainian. They live in France. So our common language is French. They don't speak English. I do not speak Ukrainian. And they have this little boy who has autism. And he was nonverbal when we started working together. And his speech, when he speaks, looks kind of apraxic. So we're using some of those like DTTC strategies, dynamic temporal tactile cueing strategies with him. But the first session was not working with him. It was working with mom, because at home they speak Ukrainian. So it was teaching her how to like think like a speech therapist so that she can go home and apply like when we're thinking about like, what is his sound inventory? What phonemes can he make? What vowels can he make? What consonants can he make? How can we combine these together? How can we choose a word with like those specific consonant and vowel shapes? And so it was really teaching her to be the speech therapist so she can do that in Ukrainian. And then when I'm working with him, I work with in French, and he has made so much progress. So like, that's super, super exciting to see. And I think if a child like that had come on my caseload, you know, like in 2013, 2014, I would have been like, no, can't do that. Not ethical. Blah, blah, blah. But now I'm like, it's maybe not the best, but it's the best for this family for right now, you know?
That's really, really interesting. And it sounds like it's been a very reflective journey of understanding your own skills and how you can use them to support a family and support a child. And I love the fact that you've gotten this Ukrainian mother involved and thinking like a speech therapist, because I know that's something they have really taught us on my course of empowering the parents to be a person of change for their child too. It's really amazing that that was happening on top of the hurdles of all the different languages, but it was still possible, and the amazing outcome that came from it.
Yeah. And we were starting at 0. I said to mom, like, do you know what a consonant is? Do you know what a vowel is? She was like, no, but she ran with it, and she has done an incredible job. And every single time I see this little boy once a week, every single time he comes in now, he's just made huge progress, more and more and more words. And his mom is just so happy. And so it's just really equipping the mom with the knowledge to know what to do at home. And then my sessions, we do a little top up in French, and like, that's it. It's great.
Oh, so inspiring. And it's amazing to think of 9 years ago when you were first coming to France, to imagine where you are today.
I know.
And I want to take you back 9 years ago of the logistical journey of how you got here, which is the more complicated part. But I'm curious to hear of, how did you prepare to take your professional status as an SLT abroad to France?
So the thing with me was that it never felt like this big monumental decision. It was just like, follow the little next step, follow the little next step, follow the little next step. And then like a few years later, I was like, oh my goodness, my whole life is so different because of this. So the first one was just arriving in France, but that wasn't a big deal because the idea was just for 1 year.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of that year, the thought wasn't, I want to live in France forever. It was just, I don't want to leave yet. So what are the things that I can do so that I don't have to leave right now? And so that was to get a better type of visa, which is why I got this civil union, a PAX, and I updated my visa status. Once I had that visa, it was like, oh, now that I have this, I can set up a private practice. Like, that's not difficult to do. All I have to do is fill out this paperwork. And logistically in France, my degree isn't recognized as an orthophoniste. I'm not a French speech therapist, which is fine. My degree is not recognized. So I work under the status of language teacher. So I just like to consider myself as like a very skilled language teacher. And the language is English, mostly. Or like communication teacher, let's say. But I keep my registration with the New Zealand Speech Therapists Association active. So I'm still, you know, part of that professional body. But once I had that visa, I was able to set up my status to be privately employed as a language teacher. And once I did that, it was just a matter of like finding clients. And then the more clients you find, the more schools you get to know, the more people know about you. And it just kind of snowballs. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, here I am all those years later. But no, you do need to have, you can't get the status to be self-employed here, which is called auto-entrepreneur. Auto-entrepreneur means self-employed. You can't get that status on a working holiday visa. You have to either have like this visa vie famille privée, which is like family life, which is what I had because I was paxed to a French person, or you have to have like a French passport or European passport to be able to set it up. So there is that thing that's a little bit complicated, that if I didn't have a partner and I was just coming from New Zealand, I wouldn't have been able to work in France. I think in the UK, you probably could come to France, or maybe not now with Brexit. I don't know.
I couldn't tell you, but because I'm American and don't have a British passport anyway, I kind of have to go through the similar loopholes that you do.
Loophole.
Yeah, of making sure I have the proper visa to be staying where legally in that country. And yeah, it's always a lot of research, reading, talking to people to try to get that properly organized.
Yeah, it's a headache, but it well worth it. Like total headache, absolutely worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched upon this already, but just to dive into it a bit more, arriving into France, you talked about how you're not an orthophoniste, but you're a highly specialist language teacher. But when you were working and building your network, did that create an obstacle for you because you weren't an orthophoniste?
It didn't. And that's only because I'm not the first person to have done this. So there are women who have been here, I think, since like the 80s who have been doing this. So I think sometimes the French orthophonistes themselves can be a little bit maybe not welcoming to the English speech therapist. I think it's partially because, I mean, we have this too as speech therapists. Our training is hard. Like we're proud to be speech therapists. It's a lot of work. And I think the French orthophonistes, they have the same thing. Like there's a lot of pride in being an orthophoniste and all the like loops you have to jump through and all the work you have to do and like how smart you have to be to get into the program anyway. And I think they're just feeling like, oh, anyone's calling themselves an orthophoniste and they didn't do the work, and feeling like I'm maybe like putting my foot where it's not welcome.
It makes me think about how speech language therapists in the UK, and I imagine in New Zealand too, it's a protected title. And so I could see in France that orthophoniste translated to speech language therapist is that protected title, and how they would feel defensive about it.
Exactly.
Just as we would feel defensive if someone's coming over and saying, oh, I do this too, but you hadn't had the same background and experience in that country. So I can see that.
And there's no mutual recognition agreement with France, you know, like with the United States and Canada, Australia, Ireland, UK, and New Zealand, we have the mutual recognition agreement where we're saying our degrees are equivalent. Like I can go to the United States and I can call myself a speech pathologist. I can go to the UK and I can call myself a speech therapist. I can go to Australia and say speech pathologist, because they're mutually recognized as being equivalent. We don't have one with France. Like there's nothing that says these degrees are equivalent. So I don't use the word orthophoniste to describe myself ever, because I don't want to go there. Like I don't want to an orthophoniste and get in trouble with the orthophonists here. Like that's not why I'm here, you know?
No, we're here to help the people who need support with their communication, and that's the goal.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Is there a resource for international SLTs, or at least SLTs working in a non-English speaking country? Is there any groups online? You mentioned the Sprint group, but is there something broader than that you've used?
Not that I'm aware of. So for me, what's happened, people will come and contact me, but I won't necessarily seek it out. So a few times I've had like someone from Turkey contacted me recently wanting to come. I've had this woman from Barcelona contacting me wanting to set up a Zoom meeting and collaborate like that. So I think they find my details on the Sprint website and then contact me that way. So I do really think it's a good website, a really great resource, but I'm not aware of any larger community. That could be a good thing to set up though. If you're looking for projects, Carly, that could be something to do.
It'll be my part-time hobby here in grad school.
As if you needed another thing to add to your list.
Right. Oh, but that's really fascinating. You built a network in France, and then you're continuing to build this international network of other SLTs all together, and you're able to support one another across different countries and possibly even across the world. So that's a really cool organic network that's formed. And I think you talking about that Sprint website is highlighting the importance of, if you are going to be doing your own private practice in a new city, of having a place where people can find you on the internet, that not only it's word of mouth, but there's a resource online where someone can find your name to contact you, know what your interests are, and go from there. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I think it's for sure the thing, at least to begin with, that got me the most referrals was joining Sprint. And if you Google speech therapists France, I think it's like one of the first things that pops up. So very grateful for that little network that they've set up, and no, it works really well.
Nice. This might be a leading question based on what we just talked about, but do you have any guidance for people who are interested in working abroad? What might be their first logistical step that they should take?
I mean, the first one depends where you're wanting to go. I think the first one has to be like visas. Can you realistically work abroad? The second one, I think, would be to ask yourself, if you can, is it going to be like, are you going to be able to work in the schools and hospitals and have something more structured? Yeah. Or is it going to be like setting up your private practice? And if it's setting up your private practice, are you okay with that not having a stable income? Like some people are, I'm okay with that. Some people are not. Some people, that's like very anxiety inducing. So I think you need to think about what type of person you are and whether the country that you're moving to is going to be able to provide you with a salaried employment, or whether you're going to have to kind of hustle a little bit harder and make it work for yourself. And then I think the third thing is just be prepared that like the first year or 2 years are challenging. Like there's no way around that. Moving overseas is hard. You miss your friends, you miss your family, you miss your culture, you miss your language, you miss all the familiar stuff. And like, it's exciting at the same time, but it's hard, and it can be really, really sad, and it can be isolating and lonely. And so I think just be willing to kind of grit your teeth, stick it out. If it's something that you want, make it work. And then also remember, at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out, you can always go home. You know, that's always an option. You know, for me, I was never like terrified of, oh my goodness, like I'm doing the wrong thing, or what if this doesn't work? Because if I go through all the situations in my head, if it doesn't work, the worst situation is I jump on a plane back to New Zealand and I find a job back in New Zealand. You know, like, yeah, I have a degree. Like if it doesn't work out here, I can go home and still work there. I don't have any interest in going back to New Zealand, but I just like to have it as like a little safety card in my back pocket, just in case. But I like to think also that, my accent is really funny now. Like that's a whole nother issue. My accent kind of warped into what it is. But I like to think that with now, like I have a second language under my belt, that I'm more valuable as an SLT because I'm able to relate to more families, more cultures, and, you know, all of that. So if I was ever to move back home to New Zealand, I like to think that I've got like some good tools up my sleeve to help me get a good job back there.
I'd like to think so too. Yes. Now, I want to wrap up the episode by treating us listeners with one of your favorite parts of living in Paris. I'm sure that there are many, but can you share with us what makes living and working in France totally worth it?
Okay, so I have like two things that I really love. I love being able to bike everywhere. And this kind of also goes with the type of work that I do of like working in clinics, working in homes, and working in schools. I move around a lot. And I have a bike that I just love. And I love being out and having like the wind on my face. And I just feel so free. And I adore that. And it's only because I live in kind of like a big city and I don't have to drive a car that I'm able to do that. So I'm really grateful. When I was in New Zealand, I had like a 45-minute commute in a car to work either way each day. And I hated it because you can't even read, you know, you had to be attentive. You were driving with a car. So I love riding my bike absolutely everywhere. The second thing that I love about Paris is this moment at the end of the day. It's especially good in winter, but in summer it works too. You go to the boulangerie and you buy your baguette, and sometimes it's still warm, and you pull the end part off and you eat the end part on your way home. It's been 9 years. I'm not sick of doing this.
I love it. And I can taste the crunchy hot baguette already.
Oh my God. Like there's literally nothing. It's just bread. There's nothing better. And the other thing along the same lines is sometimes you'll go in, there's a boulangerie that I go to that they have a little sign that says chaud, like hot, and it will tell you which of the pastries are freshly baked. And so sometimes if you go in and you'll see like the pain au chocolat are chaud, and you'll be like, I am taking one. I wasn't going to take one, but now that I know that they're there and they're warm, I'm 100% taking one. And that is like absolute heaven every time you manage to get one of those.
Well, you've left us all in complete heaven thinking about hot chocolate croissants.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Grace,
My
so much
pleasure.
for joining us. We've
My
learned
pleasure.
so much from you, and you've had a really interesting experience as an SLT and broadened my eyes of what you can do with this role. I think it's amazing what you're doing over in France. I hope to be joining you sometime soon.
Thank you, Carly.
Joining us today is Anna Volkmer. She's a lecturer at UCL, a researcher focused in dementia, and a senior speech-language therapist. Anna's been around the world as an SLT and researcher, and today we're talking about her journey of training in the UK and working in Australia. Anna, it's great to see you again. You were my lecturer yesterday, and today you're joining us on the Giving Voice podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Carly.
I want to lay the groundwork of what kind of an SLT are you? Where did you get started in your journey?
So I trained at UCL, which is where you are, obviously. But I did the undergraduate speech and language therapy course, which is a 4-year course. And I graduated in 2002. Don't tell anyone, that makes me very old. And been working since then. In 2002, I've only ever worked with adults. So I specialized very early on in working with adults, and I've always worked with adults, but I then very quickly specialized in working with adults with acquired communication difficulties and adults with dementia. So, and in fact, it was when I went overseas that I particularly developed an interest in that field. So now I'm nearly 20 years down the line. Someone said to me, a neurologist called me an unusual beast the other day. I'm one of those unusual beasts who has a clinical contract. So I work 3 days a week at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery as a senior speech and language therapist. And I specialize in working with people with dementia, particularly working with people with primary progressive aphasia, but I see people with all types of dementias. And I also work as a lecturer and researcher, and I do research developing interventions for people with dementia and their family members. And I teach on the subject of dementia.
So going back to the beginning of your career and when you were going off to Australia, was dementia your interest at the time? And had you worked in adult settings before going to Australia?
I'm born and bred in London, as some people may be able to tell. I'm born and bred and raised and went to university in London. And I worked, all my first jobs were in London. So I'd worked with people with dementia in community jobs, on the wards, but they were within a general adult dementia caseload. And the number of people with dementia that I used to see then was extremely few. So very few, really just the odd person, and really just for swallowing. I hadn't really worked heaps with people with dementia before I went to Australia. So I went to Australia in 2004.
Okay. So you hadn't worked with many people with dementia prior to Australia. So it wasn't like Australia had something with dementia that you were seeking.
No.
So why Australia?
Well, and so I say I'm born and bred in London, but I have multiple ethnicities, so to speak. I am bilingual. So my dad is German and I'm German. And I actually considered going to work in Germany as a speech and language therapist. That was, or in any occupation. I'd wanted to work outside of the United Kingdom, basically, in whatever occupation I undertook. And I'd kind of planned that from when I was younger, because my siblings had all undertaken courses where they had the opportunity to do a whole year in another country within their course. And so I knew that I couldn't necessarily do that within speech and language therapy. So I was really hopeful that I could work in another country. When I started working in the UK, though, to get my competencies signed off, of course, so that was my first port of call. I wanted to do my degree, sign off my competencies, and then explore working in other areas. I actually started dating somebody who was Australian. So put it simply, at the time, I was dating someone who was Australian, and I went on a trip to Australia, and I thought it was really a really exciting country. And actually, I didn't continue dating that Australian person who was a physiotherapist. But I had a desire to go to Australia, and I knew it was a country that I could work in very easily, because I give that example having dated an Australian physiotherapist, but at the time there were heaps and heaps of allied health professionals, including speech therapists, who were coming from Australia to the UK to work. So I knew that our qualifications were reciprocally approved. So I knew that if I went to Australia, that my qualification would be easily approved by the Speech Pathology Australia organisation, who are the equivalent of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, and that would then allow me to work, whereas I wasn't confident I could do that in other countries.
Right. So that kind of crossed Germany off the list a little bit, and you knew Australia is where you could go with your SLT title.
And actually, to be fair, I probably aborted plans to go to Germany because Australia just sounded more interesting, and I'd never been there. As a person in my early 20s, I thought it would be quite exciting to go somewhere completely different, even though it was still English speaking. But yeah, on the other side of the world, which seemed quite exciting.
Yes, I can empathize coming from the United States and coming to London, that was very exciting to be coming to a new city, a new place like that.
Exactly.
Yes. So you say Australia. Well, Australia is a big place. So what was the city that you pinned down?
So in the end, the city that I pinned down, so it's always more complicated than just wanting to go and work in another country, isn't it? There's always loads more, as you, I'm sure, have experienced, loads more in that, loads more factors that influence it. And so I actually was... at the time when I made the final decision to go to Australia, I was dating, and I'm now married to, an English person. But so he was a structural engineer and still is. He was able to get sponsorship. So he was able to get a job in Australia, and the company there paid for him to go to Australia and paid for his board. So the destination was slightly dictated by his occupational opportunities. I had applied for a skilled migrant visa. I planned that I wanted to work in Australia. So I researched it in anticipation, and I knew that I could get this skilled migrant visa because I was in my early 20s. I had an occupation that was on their skilled migrant list. And I could get my qualifications registered. So I could have worked anywhere in Australia.
Right. But
my other half at the time, he was employed by a company in Melbourne. So we went to Melbourne is the short answer. And I'm really glad we did, because Melbourne is a really beautiful city, not that I'm biased, and very multicultural, but also right on the sea. So it had all those things that England doesn't. It has a beach, it has different migrant groups, so lots of Vietnamese, lots of Japanese, and I'm talking about food as well now, but also lots of Lebanese, lots of Italians, lots of Greeks. And of course, Australia is a country full of migrants, as well as their indigenous people. But this was a really exciting hub. And so that was one of the other things that made us then stay there for 5 years, in actual fact.
Oh, wow. For 5 years. How about that? Oh, I imagine you soaked in all the Melbourne sunshine.
Yeah, although Melbourne still has seasons, not too much of a shock to the system.
Were there any sort of cultural or societal differences that perhaps were a bit more of a shock to the system? Even though you're in an English-speaking country, I've certainly found in my experience in England that there are still things that surprise me, or I find culturally different that can be sometimes a hurdle to jump over. And did you find any of those in Melbourne?
I think there were different things that impacted on my personal life versus my professional life. Perhaps were the linguistic differences. So rather than cultural, there were some subtle cultural things, but they weren't that significant. It was professionally, it was things like the phrases, the turns of language. And actually, I should say culturally I had not experienced Indigenous culture in Australia. And so it was a really emotional experience. And actually, we had some training within the workplace around that. I had to go on a bit of an emotional journey to understand the experiences of the local Indigenous people. And I have to stress there aren't many in Melbourne. There are very, very few Indigenous people, because historically, for very traumatic reasons, they were unfortunately moved along or killed, very sadly. But there's still a huge Indigenous population, and I had a lot to learn in terms of how to communicate with Indigenous people as a white person, and how to support those people in the health setting. So that was really a really valuable and emotional. I say that again because I felt sad, and I felt cross, and I felt like my eyes were opened to lots of things I hadn't really thought about before.
Yeah, I think that's what can happen when you go abroad or you leave your home, that your eyes are open to things that you didn't see or experience before. And it can be your own journey of trying to process these new experiences, as it sounds like it had been for you. You mentioned that you were in the healthcare setting, and I'm curious of what your specific role was in your healthcare setting.
So I was employed as a speech pathologist. And I was employed, so I spent 3 years working in an inpatient. I worked across 2 wards in my first job in a hospital. One ward was an acute inpatient neuro rehab ward, and one ward was a geriatric dementia ward. Then I moved to, so I'd say that was a 2.5-year job. And then I moved to another hospital for 2.5 years called the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And in that role, I worked in community and outpatient neuro rehab. And in that role, I started seeing lots and lots of people with primary progressive aphasia. I'm just reflecting on your other question about culture. And I would say within that professional role in those 2 services, the inpatient work was very similar to the UK. The community and outpatient work was a little bit different. So Australia, in each state, perhaps is more aligned with some of the principles in terms of healthcare in America. In each state, they govern their health systems independently. So rather than being completely countrywide governed. But so within the state I was in, which is Victoria, they have a private and public partnership. The services are commissioned through a public health system, but they're run by individual organisations. And the other thing is that you have to pay for some of your health care, depending on your means. But that meant that for me, as a health professional, when I went to visit people, I would have to ask them for money, small amounts. So in the community service I worked in, I'd have to ask them for money to pay for thickener powder. The way we did it is that we would sell them the thickener powder. And if they were coming to see us for appointments, they had to pay nominal amount per week for the intervention. And if they were coming to outpatients, they paid that. If we were going to see them in community, we had to check they paid that. And that was really difficult for me, having never had to ask anybody. For example, when it was thickener powder, if I had recommended somebody needed thickener in their drink and they declined to buy it, I had to clarify for myself whether could they not afford it? Did they not have capacity? Did they not understand the need for it? Or were they making a kind of unwise decision? Or was there something else going on? Whereas in the UK, some of that is taken out because you know that they're not having to pay for things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like the US, there's kind of more layers that are added into why isn't someone taking up this recommendation, that there could be more varied reasons for that. It's definitely a cultural difference that I feel learning in a UK university under a national health service compared to the United States, and how that would all work with, that there is a money transaction that happens in the US, whereas here it's not discussed really.
I also realised then it was philosophical as well, that in the UK we have philosophy that healthcare is a right, whereas I knew that intellectually, but it's not a right. You have to be able to afford it. And that's a different philosophy.
Right. Going abroad, you learn heavier things.
It's challenging, right?
It is challenging, and not to turn the conversation around too abruptly, I'd like to hear about some of the lighter things of the highlights that you experienced working in Australia and what kept you there for 5 years.
We were quite serious for a while there, but yesterday I actually gave you an anecdote. Yesterday I was saying that one of the lighter things that used to happen is when I remember assessing somebody basically, and I was assessing them using the Boston naming test, and it's a naming test, and there was an item, and there's a cigarette, and the client said it's a smoko, and I said, oh no, it's that's a language error. You've had a stroke. I'm a speech therapist. I can tell you that's a lexical / I believe it's a phonological error that you've just made. And he said, no, that's a word. And I remember saying, no, it's not. And he was saying, yes, it is. And then he said, go across the corridor. And I went across to the psychologist, and she said, oh, Anna, that's actually an Australian word. It can mean cigarette. So there were always those entertaining things that happened. But that's the kind of stuff that made it worthwhile, because it was exciting and funny. And I enjoyed working with people in Australia. I enjoyed meeting lots of different people who I'd never have met in the UK. And I really enjoyed working. So when I started working at the Royal Melbourne, I had this wonderful opportunity to work with people with primary progressive aphasia, and that was really exciting. And that was also something else that kept me there professionally, but personally I stayed there because it was fun. I said it right at the beginning. I was living in a house on the beach, and the food was amazing. The food in Australia was so great, and I do a lot of running and cycling and swimming, and I could go to the end of my road and jump in the ocean and see, we were in a city, but you could see dolphins out to sea. It sounds really romantic, doesn't it?
It does.
It does. I remember we went camping in this park that was maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of Melbourne. And we went for a walk there, and we just saw a whale just kind of pottering, along in the sea. And I was like, oh, yeah, there's a whale, But
just casually, a beautiful whale in the ocean in Australia.
There's a whale.
So I'm already daydreaming of, can I go be an SLT in Australia? That sounds nice. But you're now back in London.
Yeah.
And so your Australia chapter eventually came to an end. And do you mind sharing what prompted you to come back home?
It was nothing more complicated than it being just really far away from my family. So, for example, when I'd call my family, it would be morning here and it would be evening where I was, or it would be evening where I was and I was about to go to bed and everyone else is getting up for work. So even just having a phone when it was just too far away. And we decided that we were at the point in our lives where we wanted to decide to buy a home and settle down longer. And we just decided to come back at that point. And I thought that coming back to London, of course, that I would be coming back to the centre of the universe, because London is the centre of the universe. I'd come back and it would be quite exciting to come back. Having started becoming way more interested in dementia and primary progressive aphasia, I thought there would be a great opportunity to come back and do some more research. I should mention, actually, I did actually do my master's in Australia in clinical rehabilitation, all remotely. That's how they do a lot, or they did way pre-pandemic. They did a lot of their work at the universities. A lot of the studying was remote, watching online lectures or participating in online conversations. I remember vividly that you were given 5% of a module grade if simply by participating in the chat forum. So you had to make a relevant comment in the chat once per week across a semester just to get 5% of your grade for one of our modules.
Wow. Well, I'm not very active in the UCL chat, so I'm glad that that's not a part of it there, but wow. So yeah, you can really empathize with the online learning that the cohorts have right now for the course. Yeah. And that actually makes me think, I believe that Australia had been doing telehealth a lot longer than the UK or other areas of the world had. So was that something that you were dabbling in a little bit when you were in Australia?
Yeah, I'm nodding and shaking my head for the listeners. Yeah, I didn't do any remote teletherapy while I was there. It was more my colleagues, But we talked about it a lot, and there was always the kind of anecdotes around what worked well and what didn't. But it worked really well because in community, so outside of Melbourne, in the really, really regional areas, very unlike England and the UK, I say that, but there are positions like this, but I think even more so in Australia and America, where somebody will be employed as the one speech therapist in a remote town or village to do everything from paediatrics to, 0 to 101, whatever, birth to death. They'd be doing everything in between. So they'd have to be skilled across the board. And what would happen is that the specialist speech and language therapist would Skype in remotely. So when I was in Melbourne, there was a number of therapists that would do the Skyping in, mainly for laryngectomy management. Where I was working, there was a particular therapist who specialised in laryngectomy. And so she would often have Skype calls. I think topic was often long-term tracheostomy management, head and neck cancer generally. They were doing that quite a lot across those specialisms. I had a very close friend who was a medic, and she worked up in Cairn, which is up in the north of Queensland. There are lots and lots of remote Indigenous communities.
Interesting.
Who receive healthcare through aeroplanes traveling to their remote settlements. Wow. And she was one of those doctors. She'd go out on the aeroplanes and go and visit people. And we all thought this was so exciting. And she said it, and I think it was in elements, but I think it was also really hard work. But that was she'd tell us amazing stories about, having to be in an aeroplane or a helicopter and get to somebody who was about to give birth. And so, really exciting things like that.
Oh my gosh. So it sounds like you've seen a whole other side of the healthcare careers that you can have in Australia. That is super interesting. Yeah, I can't believe that. Airplanes to fly out and provide your services to a group of people. That's wild.
There used to be a TV program called Flying Doctors. It's probably before your time. And that's essentially what she did. She was a flying doctor.
Wow. The more you know. Yeah. So before you went to Australia, maybe you didn't know that existed. And so I'm going to bring you back to before you even landed there. How did you go about preparing for this big move to Australia where you didn't necessarily know what was going to be on the other side?
I'm not sure I did much preparation. What did I do? I did I remember taking heaps of notes. So I had only graduated 2 years. And then I went to Australia. So I remember taking as many practicable resources as I could. So I definitely did that to make sure that I had it all with me. But that was about it, I think. I don't think I did much else. Probably the naive how old was I? 23-year-old, 24-year-old. Oh.
But sometimes not remembering or not knowing all the details is what gives you the courage to go in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
You'll figure it out later.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, exactly. It was exciting. I didn't know that I would stay for 5 years. I thought I'd only go for 1 year.
Yeah, that's what I told my family when I left the US, that it'll be 1 year in France and then I'll be back. And then it's been France and now London and who knows.
How long have you been in Europe?
I was in Paris for 3 years and now I'm in my second year here in London. So about 5 years.
Wow. Are you anticipating going back or staying here? Or is that's the big question? You can't answer that on air, can you?
Yeah, you can't tell my family, but I don't know if I'm feeling to go back to Chicago too soon. I've got bit by the travel bug and I've loved it over here. So I'm not keen to leave quite yet.
Yeah, fair enough. I did an observership with the dementia service in Chicago a couple of years ago. I went and visited some speech therapists working in Chicago and some geriatricians and neurologists. It's a beautiful city.
Thank you. I'm a bit biased. I think so as well. But I think that's a really cool thing to hear. And what speaking to Kirsty and speaking to Grace, the other guest on the podcast, is I feel that there's a misconception about SLTs sometimes, that it's very based in English, it's based in your home country. There's kind of a structured way that you're expected to kind of go from student, your newly qualified therapist year, and then go into your working role and kind of work that ladder. but there is a lot of possibility to work abroad and to have these opportunities to go to Chicago. And a part that I feel like isn't always talked about in SLT, but is a really cool facet of it, that we can collaborate across borders like this.
Yeah. And if you go into research, absolutely. The reason I went over there was I was doing a research observership mainly because there's a huge research centre at Northwestern University, the main university in Chicago, and where Marcel Meslem, who's a neurologist, set up a huge, amazing, one of the most amazing research centres in the States for PPA. Marcel Meslem discovered PPA and he works in Chicago.
I didn't know that. I just learned something about my hometown.
Yeah, exactly. And doing research, you need to make international connections. So in my fellowships that I receive for my research funding, integral to them is opportunities for networking overseas, because that's how you develop your research network and further research. So I've been to Chicago, I've been to Melbourne again. I managed to lever in a trip back to Melbourne. I've also been to New York and met with a speech therapist there once. That was a bit more informal, but you get to go everywhere. And when you go to conferences as well, especially as a clinician, but also in research, you get to meet researchers and clinicians from all over the place. I've been to Portugal, I've been to Germany, I've been to Oslo, I've been to France, but that's all kind of going to conferences, and at these conferences generally meeting other speech and language therapists. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think at all that your time in Australia kind of opened your eyes to opportunities to be able to do research with people from other places in the world?
So it didn't open my eyes to that research career. That definitely happened through my networks in the UK. But what I have realised is that now I have heaps of connections in Australia, and that's been a huge advantage in developing research projects. So it's certainly given me a step up.
Oh, so interesting. And when you were in Australia, was there any steps or procedures you had to follow to make sure your protected title was intact while in a foreign country?
I was able to get registered with Speech Pathology Australia. So then I became a speech pathologist in Australia. So that's the equivalent professional title. And then I became a member of them for the whole time I was working there. So it's absolutely identical in terms of maintaining your professional qualification. And then when I returned, I lapsed. I didn't continue paying for my Royal College membership in the UK, but I re-triggered my Royal College membership. And I just then had to demonstrate evidence of having worked in Australia. So I was able to then use I think I had to get a referee maybe, or just show my CPD or something like that. So maybe I had to get a letter from my employer in Australia. Just to, very simply, it wasn't at all arduous, just to say that I was returning. And then they continued my membership of Royal College. It was much harder to get recognised in Australia. I needed to literally get a printout of my undergraduate degree to show the number of hours I'd done in every subject. So it's the transcript of my degree. And that at the time was a bit tricky to get hold of. I don't think it is now. From when I qualified, everything had not been really electronic, and they'd gone to electronic. So I think just getting everything into an electronic format, you wouldn't have a problem nowadays with that.
We'd hope so.
Yeah, you'd be fine.
So it sounds like it was more complicated to try to get that protected title in Australia. But when you came to the UK, it was an easy transition coming back to your home country.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then how about culturally? I mean, they talk about when you go to a new place, how you have to adapt to a new setting and you have to get used to all these new things. But arguably, I think there is also a transition of coming back home after being away for so long. And how did that go for you, not only professionally, but personally too, adapting back to London culture?
It was like stepping into an old pair of slippers. It was fine. It was lovely. It was so totally fine. It was very comfortable. It was a bit of a relief personally and somewhat professionally. I tell you what I did notice, however, was that over that 5-year period, the NHS services had become much more restricted. So the funding had been limited. And when I returned, so in Australia, it was almost, if I had to generate analogy, it was almost like going from Australia being back in time a little bit, so they're a bit better resourced. And I remember in Australia when I worked there, if you went on annual leave, they'd employ somebody to cover your annual leave. Never in my entire career in England has that ever happened. You're going on annual leave, go away. When you come back, you'll have a huge pile of work waiting for you. So there were things like that were a bit of a kind of shock to the system, and things like you must do CPD. And then I came back to the UK, and it was because of the nature of the NHS funding. It was I came to a position and I barely had time to go to the toilet, let alone maintain my CPD. So just those kind of cultural shifts that are very, I guess they're not tenuously linked. They are linked to funding, commissioning, politics. Mm-hmm. And so that was a bit of an adjustment, but certainly a way of evaluating and seeing the good in other health systems, and also seeing the good in our own health system. But otherwise, it was lovely.
It sounds like it. It also sounds like it was a very reflective experience in the end. As SLTs, I know we need to reflect on our experiences, and it sounds like you really got to reflect on different healthcare systems, why different things work the way that they do. I feel like that gives an interesting insight to how the NHS functions and how we work in the system we do here in England. I think that's a perk that happens when you go away and then come back to something with fresh eyes.
Exactly. I'm sure you see that a little bit, even as a person who's lived in different countries, you can make those observations.
Definitely. And now I want to link in your research just a little bit, because this was a really big part of your career. So when you came back from Australia, you got into another SLT role, and then did your research kind of stem off from there, or when did you begin really going into the research path?
So earlier on, I kind of made that reference joke to the London being the centre of the universe. And I have to say, when I worked in Australia, I was working with people with primary progressive aphasia. It was a new area there. And I was working at the Royal Melbourne, which is a bit like working at UCLH or Royal London or St Thomas's. It's a big central urban hospital. And what would happen is in Melbourne, we'd get referrals from people in regional areas and more urban areas of Melbourne, referring people with PPA to us. And they're saying, I don't know what to do with these people with PPA, and we look after them. And then I came back to the UK and I thought, it's all fine. I'm coming back to London. They'll be on top of it. They'll have been working with people with primary progressive aphasia, and I'll come back and it'll be really interesting to link back in with that network. And I started working at a hospital, South London, the Maudsley NHS Trust, which is a mental health trust that covers a large proportion of the South London boroughs. That was great. So it was not a dissimilar organisation from that I'd been working to in Melbourne. But what I found was that in none of the networks I was linking into were speech therapists any more informed about primary progressive aphasia. I found that I was identifying a gap. So I was identifying a gap in our clinical knowledge, and I decided to write an article for the Bulletin magazine based on my experiences in Melbourne. And I wrote about my experiences of working with people with PPA, and I was approached by a publisher and they invited me to submit a book proposal. And I thought, why not? Let's give it a bash. And I submitted a book proposal and they accepted it, and I wrote this book. And during that process, that really forced me to completely immerse myself in the research literature. I already kind of had done, but I was really getting into the research literature, and I started developing an appetite then for doing the research myself, and realized that perhaps I could. Having graduated university thinking that I wasn't clever enough to do research, I realized that perhaps didn't need to be clever enough. I just had to be determined and had to see a gap, an opportunity.
It's crazy because it sounds like from that article you wrote in the Bulletin talking about your experiences in Melbourne, that experience abroad was really this leap pad into so many other avenues, and could have never imagined back in 2004 when you went abroad, where it's brought you today. So that's fascinating. That's such a cool journey where you've gone. And I want to start to wrap up the episode by kind of highlighting some of your favorite parts of Australia. You talked about the whales, the beaches, the food, What could you say if you had to pinpoint what was your one favorite thing about living in Australia? What would that be?
Oh, I don't know if I can do that.
I'll give you 3. You can share 3 of your favorite things.
The outdoors, the food, and the people, the friends.
Nice. And would you do it all again?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. It was so great to hear about your journey from UCL around the world and now back to UCL as a lecturer and everything you've done in between. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely chatting.
This concludes the Giving Voices mini-series of SLTs working internationally. But hopefully it's just the beginning of your journey to take speech and language therapy abroad. Until next time, I'm Carly, signing off.